Hello, and thank you for joining me today. In 1948, in the United Kingdom, after the war, social care and the NHS were launched. It was believed that if they had a bit of a lift up, people would move off and no longer require it. That was 76 years ago. Our government had similar aspirations when the NDIS was launched 11 years ago. It was believed that those participating would be able to work and move off the scheme, or it would effectively pay for it that way. They also had no idea how many people would use it and how much it would cost. They estimated around $13 billion. Currently, it's running at $42 billion, with around 650,000 utilising the scheme and projected to cost $125 billion by 2034. The Disability Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse and Neglect cost around $600 million. They commissioned a report from Taylor Fry, which stated that in 2021-2023, an additional $46 billion was incurred due to violence, abuse and neglect, with $27 billion alone being due to the systemic failures or failures of the system. Yet we are still struggling to get the states on board, despite high-profile mental health stabbings in shopping centres. It is true that it has enabled some into work. It is also true that a great proportion of new employment for the country is in this sector, and that there is an economic benefit for every dollar spent, a return of around, say, $2.40 for every dollar spent by the government. Though in earnest, I doubt all costs are covered when we consider the associated costs if they were counted diligently. I will eagerly point out to you that we see the costs of our social care failures in our aged care system and disability care system in our ambulances ramping. As much as the premiers are pushed to solve the ramping crisis, they won't solve it by fudging bed numbers, by stuffing people in nursing homes or so-called transitional facilities. They won't solve our society issues by dumping mental health and the othered disabled either, as recent incidents shone a light on ever so brightly. A few more hundred beds when there are thousands waiting years on waiting lists is merely sleight of hand. The state and federal governments need to stop this robbing Peter to pay Paul bollocks and see the costs of their actions and take responsibility. While you're at it, please remember the 90% of disabled people not on the NDIS, especially the over 65s who are all but invisible. This is a kind of a composting form of economics. Of course, without Medicare or the dole or other schemes like return to work or work cover, the cost to society would be significant. These things are provided not on a return on investment composting arrangement, as it will make flowers grow later analysis, but on a human rights entitlement basis. This is also the basis for the NDIS, which is a human rights model of care. The benefits to society aren't so much counted as felt. Valuing human life and being a progressive society isn't something an actuary counts, but a population benefits from in its expenditure. The United Nations Articles of Human Rights for Disabled Persons isn't an extremist manifesto. It is reasonable and indeed necessary as a foundation of progressive realisation. Some things like civic rights are expected now, but it is understood, as it is in all of Australia, that money is not infinite and it takes time to get there, and thus we have a work in progress. This is especially important because there are 27 million people in Australia and we have a cost of living crisis, a housing crisis and a standard of living crisis. The pie is only so big, and like with household budgets, money in one direction neglects the other. Children without good education, a stable family and roof over their heads and a proper diet can lose their right to a life of well-being and purpose. And as tax-paying citizens, we could effectively create more people with disabilities. The balance is important, and it is also important that as a nation, that progressive realisation progresses all Australians. The NDIS has thus become a point of concern because of its great cost for so few, despite the positive outcomes in the lives of so many. In the eagerness to revamp the system, because the old one was an ineffective, incompetent, bureaucratic behemoth, We created a centralised behemoth. The states concerned about the cost blowout and eager to offload everything they could, especially mental health, as well as disability, have dropped the ball and abandoned its people. The system was so poorly managed that it has become a circus. The NDIS doesn't connect with other government departments, so health and disability don't work together. Just about every other government department will point you towards the federal government and the NDIS for anything that remotely looks like disability, if you receive the NDIS or not. We failed to prepare anyone for the NDIS, not government, not families, not participants, and not the workforce. In fact, we barely have what we could define as a workforce at all. We had a hugely expensive Royal Commission, then a year-long review, and we finally came to some conclusions of what needs to happen next. Clearly something does, because what is really infuriating is despite the huge flow of money, we aren't getting the outcomes, the lofty aspirations of the NDIS promised for all. It's haphazard. Sure, some have purchased diamond rings and paid for their shopping and used their NDIS as a tax-free tap of money to top up their income. Employed family and friends, they might have had greater material security, but it still didn't equate to quality in life or care. Many got nothing at all, or huge plans and couldn't even get a clean bathroom out of it. Huge numbers of providers aren't making money at all. We are at workforce failure, and fraud is absolutely rife. Had the NDIS been a social experiment on human nature, the outcomes there may indeed have funded itself. It was the modern gold rush of the century, which ironically may explain where we are at now, a kind of NDIS stockade. In one corner, we have your average participant who just want it to be fair, consistent, competent, and safe. They need it to be far less complicated and would like their lives back from the constant trauma of the uncertainty and constant goalposts moving from the NDIS and the NDIA. Some have been fortunate to receive the life-changing outcomes spoken of, and some have not. Too many have not. Then we have an enclave of advocates who, despite amazing results in gaining a Royal Commission and the implementation of an NDIS, have become extremists. Just as the coal lobbyists and primary industry used to, and still comparatively do, held the government by the proverbial, the idealists do so now. They want an open checkbook. They want staff to be totally unskilled and providers to remain unregistered, unregulated, and so-called flexible. Their concerns are related to choice and control, without any thought of what choice and control is, what those boundaries are, or the real lives of the majority on the NDIS. Inside their bubbles of ideology, they fail to see or speak for the over 65s, intellectually disabled, as well as others who live outside their bubble of knowledge, which is their own experience exclusively. Just like the rest, there are multiple conflicts of interest, as like everyone else in this game of musical chairs, ironically spoken, they rush to secure their own. I'd very much like to ask the question with self-management, as 80% are actually managed by family or guardians, or nominees, or microboards, just how much choice and control there actually is. We are supposed to be creating a system that provides everyone with choice and control, and not the few who have the informal supports to basically do it. For those who choose choice and control, is it at what cost to those who feel they must self-manage or be in an abyss? Wouldn't it be better if the system catered for everyone? That everyone had choice and control and the best life that they possibly could? Then isn't it really a choice to be self-managed? How is it a choice when you're self-managed because that's the only way you feel you get choice and control and bugger everybody else? What about families who have jobs or other siblings? Managing staff in the NDIS is no picnic. So whose choice and control are we talking about here? The problem with providers being unregistered is we now have 150,000 of them as opposed to 15,000 registered. There is no rule of thumb that can say all registered or all unregistered are bad or good. But what can I say with conviction is the ability to regulate, to police and penalise or control those providers who are unregulated isn't even possible. Enforcement of standards is impossible. Just as other regulations in our lives save lives, so will the standards and regulations in the disability arena. Just like the rest of society, it will fail a part of the time because there are too many variables and unpredictable outcomes. People still manage to electrocute themselves despite rules and regulations, for instance. There is always a human factor, just as people still do drugs and commit murder. But we don't decide to have no laws and say, oh, it doesn't work in every case. Yet the ideologists continue in their cast iron bubble. Then there are the support staff whose role has changed enormously and their value as an ally and safeguarding tool grossly underestimated. Employed often casually, they have irregular hours, often unreasonable demands, poor or no training, no support and no backup for themselves. They are expected to be fit for purpose with training, which is either overpriced and inadequate or useless for its application. As we now have psychosocial and mental illness in our remit, with even those who have committed serious crimes, we're expected to attend alone, unsupervised, untrained, with no tools for the job. Then there are the providers, who are largely still trying to operate the same model of care, an institutionalised model in a community setting. There is a distinct lack of innovation, and the solution to profitability is not throw more money at it. The majority of providers are very good, and there is definitely some excellent work being done. They have been operating in an unfair marketplace with constant change and uncertainty. They are, in many cases, providing services for free to alleviate moral responsibility, sometimes in a risk management bid and sometimes out of the goodness of their hearts. There are several unsung heroes in this area, including the mums, the dads, husbands, wives, family and friends whose lives have been turned upside down. And amongst this are the LACs, the plan management companies, the support coordinators, social workers, allied health professionals, and the NDIA and NDIS staff. All of us are pretty much in the same boat. No paddle, no map, and no water either. Not to mention the issues of adversarial nature of the AAT, the toxic culture in the workforce, and often in the disability community. There is very little community or cohesion. As an advocate and a provider, can you imagine having a business which was high in cost for conformity, a cost in training, a cost in auditing, a cost in insurance, and administratively with implementing and enforcing those changes? Then imagine the same business setting up next door to you in this free-for-all frenzy that has none of those costs. Does that look fair to you? Our social contract as citizens with our government is based on trust and accountability. I know, very funny. But really, they have to be accountable for our money, right? Especially when it's looking like it will dwarf Medicare. Now there's progressive realisation and working towards the UN CRPD, just as we work towards the UN sustainability goals for a better future for all of us. But it is recognised that this is a new system and that there are 27 million people and we are living in post-COVID times, which had as much impact as the Second World War economically. So radical extremist ideology as an advocate is a waste of time. The stockade is that standoff whereby some believe that unregistered are better and all registered providers are big and they want it their way and bugger everyone else. Unregistered don't have to have, and this is to trade as an NDIS provider according to the Quality and Safeguards Commission. They don't have to have security checks, any qualifications, any paperwork or procedures, any insurance, any audits, just a free ABN, and anyone, literally anyone, can, and believe me, anyone has, become a provider for our most vulnerable with no accountability for taxpayers' money. This is why we have no idea where some of our participants are. There are those who can't rent houses fast enough to fill each room with a participant. All about the money. This kind of farming, it's kind of like the new puppy farming. And just like McDonald's is about real estate and not burgers, so is disability care. SDA and group homes are the greatest financial incentive, not to enrich participants' lives, but investors' pockets. Plus, and this is important, When we launched the NDIS beyond a purple band-aid, none of the systemic issues within disability care were solved. Just as none of those issues systemically have been addressed. We left sores to fester, and many of the bigger ones are buying up the smaller ones. Their competition, they are just waiting for the market to implode. And as far as choice is concerned, it will be the red apple or the green apple. But hey, they will both be apples. Yet there is an extremist ideological cohort who attack registered providers as if they are all the big ones. Lived experience is relevant when it comes to speaking on that, but not across an entire systemic change. This discriminatory attitude, no doubt born from trauma from the past, is harming the small registered providers such as myself, who believe in quality, believe in change and flexibility, to which these others are unable to see the new innovations. That is beyond their own lived experience. Change is a certainty, eventually, if we allow it. And I can't help thinking that the over 65s were sacrificed to bolster the aged care system, which is equally a train wreck. The media reports from afar with punchy headlines and emotional stories. But just as most people have so little understanding of the NDIS beyond legislatively or politically, it doesn't understand where the story actually is. It isn't the amount that's being spent, it's how it's being spent. It is not is care being delivered, but is it effective, giving quality of life beyond survival to thriving? It's the conversations we should be having that makes me despair. The lost opportunity to dogma and rigid ideology, to misinformation and opinions without the benefits of the facts, or in fact, in spite of them. So here we are, amongst all of the recommendations, registration is the biggest sticking point. That and housing. We have a cost of living crisis and a severe housing crisis. We can't afford to build homes for every participant. We can't afford ineffective, socially irresponsible million-dollar plans. We have to act like members of the whole, the community, the nation, and understand that sharing is a necessity and we can only give what is necessary, because anything beyond the tools for life, beyond human rights, is human privilege. We can't be campaigning to be included in a society that we have no care for. Yes, everyone should have their own home. Yes, I agree in human rights, but I also believe in change and innovation and thinking outside the box. It is that which we need to do now. Moving on from the magic pudding concept to a self-sourcing one. We must recognise ourselves as a part of Australia and the Australian community, just as the disability community must include all disabilities and fairly represent everyone, both in and outside the NDIS. Once the NDIS has given us the tools, we must use them and realise not only quality of life as opposed to just quality in care, but genuine independence. To do that, we have to look beyond the reforms and into the nitty-gritty at the heart of the mechanism that is society. Find the needle in the haystack, tighten the bolts under the hood, instead of just an oil change. We need to give it a good CIC, a kick. Not a fan of acronyms. I couldn't escape the kick pun, so forgive me and indulge me a little longer. The first C represents community. The re-establishment and use of a community as a resource. Move away from paternalism and state nannyhood by taking responsibility. In order to do that, we need to uphold the communities of old. Build communities, not just suburbs and dormitory towns. The very architecture and planning of our cities have watered the seeds of loneliness and isolation. The economic fallout of an ever-increasing GDP and linear model has also cost us greatly. Our greatest capital is human capital, and it's been depleted. And our greatest resource and fallback, being the family unit, has been weakened. The culture of the community needs to evolve to be one of togetherness and independence, with family and family culture at its core. The culture change needs to be inclusive, not intolerance, inclusion, as we see currently, but inclusion no matter what your beliefs or who you are. Just let it be enough that You are. And that be all that is required of you. To be included, a move away from identity politics to community core values with the contemporary ideals we have gathered at its core. Lifestyles and working arrangements need to evolve to include and favour families. Inclusion must contain trust and transparency, authenticity, with an end to misinformation, with the embracing of good psychologically safe communication. We have to focus on community and community strengthening. We need each other. It is our family and our community units that have enabled us to survive whatever the universe has thrown at us. As individuals rely more heavily on governments, we need to enable parental choice to work or be at home. We need to allow family to function. Those foundations provide resources of huge intrinsic value to each and every one of us. The second letter of KIC is an I for innovation. Why do we need to only look at government for funding? How can we change the bones of disability to really place autonomy and self-realisation in the hands of everyone? We certainly won't achieve that through forcing employers to support people with a disability or to force those people into open employment. Yes, we need to legislate equality, of course. However, we need to facilitate it and not keep trying to hammer that square peg into a round hole. Let's look at entrepreneurial avenues. Let's look at building life skills and tacit social skills that an ableist society is robbed people of by treating people differently, like children. Let's dismiss the curse of low expectations and really look at how can that person make the best of the skills they have and then evolve the workforce and workplace that facilitates that. Look, for instance, at COVID and how working from home was such a game changer. There is a massive terrain of unexplored options we need to look at. Different, more affordable care models and models that empower people with disability to own their own care outcomes. Having a seat at the table sounds dandy, but what if they owned the damn table? Lastly, the last C in KIC is competence. If I could give or say one word to change everything, it would be competence. Each enclave or team group has its own perspective, and neither sees the other's point of view. But the deeper issue is they don't fully understand their own systemically. They have even less of a clue, and the lack of interaction between government departments is just stunning. Incompetence from the lack of health equity to access to health services, to access to employment, and the general confusion amongst the public. The cacophony of clusterfuck just dazzles the mind. It's layered so well and so deeply entrenched that even Sarah Lee would be astonished. We need training for the workforce and recognition of the workforce, and the involvement for the role training needs to reflect practical and reality. There needs to be career progression and a change in culture between participants and staff. There is a heavy adversarial barrier here, which is toxic, coming from both sides and resulting in a stigma in the role and a stigma in fear and trauma that comes with having staff from the participants' point of view. Too many aren't capable effectively, uninsurable and dangerous, and insidiously so. The lack of right care compounds, affecting quality of life and adding to the cost of care because of poor outcomes and poor health, wrong seating medication, missing clinical observations, lack of motivation and underutilisation of plans to facilitate systemic integration. If staff were professionally trained and registered, they could be accepted more readily inside, say, the hospital system, and not only be employed by them, lessening the more expensive cost of nursing care, but be of greater service to the participants. If hospitals understood disability with some much needed disability education, it would equate to health equity and plan reduction through the participant's life. There also needs to be public and corporate education. You can't just create something in a vacuum and expect the community to embrace it. You have to have disability representation, education, in order to have acceptance. You must have understanding first. It won't happen through osmosis or magical thinking, unless we have a few more 100 years to wait. You have to include the people who you want to be inclusive with. However, I will say that one of the biggest issues was the NDIS failed to educate participants about the NDIS, and misinformation, incorrect information, has contributed greatly to the chaos, helping to breed a poor culture. Now, whilst the UN recognises progressive realisation, it does not do so with regards to civic rights. There should be zero tolerance for government bodies, especially who do not provide accessible services. We should start with the health equity, and we should do that immediately. Whatever we do next, it must, in my opinion, involve that kick: community, innovation and competence at its core. With regards to the NDIS Stockade on the issue of registration, I don't believe this is actually a disability issue, actually. This is a national issue, and it's about making sure that providers are competent in as much as it is important that the workforce is fit for purpose and seen again as the wonderful career that it is. This will greatly strengthen quality and safeguards and plan outcomes and directly enable participants to live a fulfilling life. It isn't about getting people off the NDIS. It's how they live and contribute to society and their own lives whilst on it. Be that as a mother or father, a son or daughter, an advocate, a mentor, a lawyer, a teacher or participant. All that we should require is that they are, and they are the best version of that person that they can be. Just as in education or the dole or work cover, we can never guarantee lofty outcomes. Those that reach those goals, I applaud them. But I also applaud those who, just like the rest of us, just do the best that they can with what they have. We value them as a valid member of society for the contribution of their lives. As a society, our responsibility is to ensure that the burdens of day-to-day care are minimal, so that they are free to have a fair crack, just like the rest of us. I don't believe we can do that without the elephant in the room here, which is the workforce, and a framework that is accountable, competent, regulated, and registered. We must strengthen that provider base, not create competitive inequalities. We must facilitate fairness and excellence in care with a set of standards that are based on real world and not ideology, and progress, and realise our commitment to a brighter future for all Australians. Just as tax is an inevitability, so is regulation. They are intrinsically connected, and it is a definitive part of our social contract that we get the best bang for our buck. And that means the best outcomes for all, as the well-being of many is a stake. We should dally no longer with working together as a community to achieve that common goal, working for the common good of all. So as much as it would seem that those that entered the homes and care for our most vulnerable in the aftermath of a Royal Commission should be qualified and providers should be registered, as much as we should be gobsmacked that there were ever unregistered providers, those in the way are those with disabilities themselves, in many cases. And so we have an NDIS stockade. I argue that regulation is not a disability issue. It is a social contract because the funding comes from taxpayers' money. Choice and control is about choosing supports and having control over your care. The rest is like the rest of us, up to us to make a life from there. None of us have control over our lives, just the parts we can. No more than we control the weather. Outside of the government's requirement to be accountable and providers to provide the best care they can, this should never limit the choice and control of anybody. Supported decision-making, making new pathways and new innovations rather than arguing the old rhetoric should be our priority now, so that those with no voice, no person to manage their care for them, can live the same and equal life with the same choices as any other person who relies on the NDIS to equalise their opportunity for self-actualisation and self-determination. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. And if this has provoked any thoughts or feeling, please share them in the comments and let's keep the discussion going.